the new God of humanity, the new gods of humanity, the new God of humanity, the new goddess of humanity, the new goddesses of humanity, the new goddess of humanity, the old God of humanity, the old gods of humanity, the old God of humanity, the old goddess of humanity, the old goddesses of humanity, the old goddess of humanity, the greater God of humanity, the greater gods of humanity, the greater God of humanity, the greater goddess of humanity, the greater goddesses of humanity, the greater goddess of humanity, the lesser God of humanity, the lesser gods of humanity, the lesser God of humanity, the lesser goddess of humanity, the lesser goddesses of humanity, the lesser goddess of humanity, the higher God of humanity, the higher gods of humanity, the higher God of humanity, the higher goddess of humanity, the higher goddesses of humanity, the higher goddess of humanity, the lower God of humanity, the lower gods of humanity, the lower God of humanity, the lower goddess of humanity, the lower goddesses of humanity, the lower goddess of humanity, the greater spirit of humanity, the greater spirits of humanity, the greater spirit of humanity, the lesser spirit of humanity, the lesser spirits of humanity, the lesser spirit of humanity, the higher spirit of humanity, the higher spirits of humanity, the higher spirit of humanity, the lower spirit of humanity, the lower spirits of humanity, the lower spirit of humanity, the major God of humanity, the major gods of humanity, the major God of humanity, the major goddess of humanity, the major goddesses of humanity, the major goddess of humanity, the minor God of humanity, the minor gods of humanity, the minor God of humanity, the minor goddess of humanity, the minor goddesses of humanity, the minor goddess of humanity, the superior God of humanity, the superior gods of humanity, the superior God of humanity, the superior goddess of humanity, the superior goddesses of humanity, the superior goddess of humanity, the inferior God of humanity, the inferior gods of humanity, the inferior God of humanity, the inferior goddess of humanity, the inferior goddesses of humanity, the inferior goddess of humanity, the ancestor God of humanity, the ancestor gods of humanity, the ancestor God of humanity, the ancestor goddess of humanity, the ancestor goddesses of humanity, the ancestor goddess of humanity, the ascendant God of humanity, the ascendant gods of humanity, the ascendant God of humanity, the ascendant goddess of humanity, the ascendant goddesses of humanity, the ascendant goddess of humanity, the descendant God of humanity, the descendant gods of humanity, the descendant God of humanity, the descendant goddess of humanity, the descendant goddesses of humanity, the descendant goddess of humanity, the transcendent God of humanity, the transcendent gods of humanity, the transcendent God of humanity, the transcendent goddess of humanity, the transcendent goddesses of humanity, the transcendent goddess of humanity, the past God of humanity, the past gods of humanity, the past God of humanity, the past goddess of humanity, the past goddesses of humanity, the past goddess of humanity, the present God of humanity, the present gods of humanity, the present God of humanity, the present goddess of humanity, the present goddesses of humanity, the present goddess of humanity, the future God of humanity, the future gods of humanity, the future God of humanity, the future goddess of humanity, the future goddesses of humanity, the future goddess of humanity, the authentic God of humanity, the authentic gods of humanity, the authentic God of humanity, the authentic goddess of humanity, the authentic goddesses of humanity, the authentic goddess of humanity, the synthetic God of humanity, the synthetic gods of humanity, the synthetic God of humanity, the synthetic goddess of humanity, the synthetic goddesses of humanity, the synthetic goddess of humanity, the progressive God of humanity, the progressive gods of humanity, the progressive God of humanity, the progressive goddess of humanity, the progressive goddesses of humanity, the progressive goddess of humanity, the regressive God of humanity, the regressive gods of humanity, the regressive God of humanity, the regressive goddess of humanity, the regressive goddesses of humanity, the regressive goddess of humanity, the ordinary god of humanity, the ordinary gods of humanity, the ordinary god of humanity, the ordinary goddess of humanity, the ordinary goddesses of humanity, the ordinary goddess of humanity, the extraordinary god of humanity, the extraordinary gods of humanity, the extraordinary god of humanity, the extraordinary goddess of humanity, the extraordinary goddesses of humanity, the extraordinary goddess of humanity, the static god of humanity, the static gods of humanity, the static god of humanity, the static goddess of humanity, the static goddesses of humanity, the static goddess of humanity, the dynamic god of humanity, the dynamic gods of humanity, the dynamic god of humanity, the dynamic goddess of humanity, the dynamic goddesses of humanity, the dynamic goddess of humanity, the land god of humanity, the land gods of humanity, the land god of humanity, the land goddess of humanity, the land goddesses of humanity, the land goddess of humanity, the sea god of humanity, the sea gods of humanity, the sea god of humanity, the sea goddess of humanity, the sea goddesses of humanity, the sea goddess of humanity, the sky god of humanity, the sky gods of humanity, the sky god of humanity, the sky goddess of humanity, the sky goddesses of humanity, the sky goddess of humanity, the god of humanity, the gods of humanity, the god of humanity, the goddess of humanity, the goddesses of humanity, the goddess of humanity, the half god of humanity, the half gods of humanity, the half god of humanity, the half goddess of humanity, the half goddesses of humanity, the half goddess of humanity, the vessel of humanity, the vessels of humanity, the vessel of humanity, the name of humanity, the names of humanity, the name of humanity, the person of humanity, the persons of humanity, the person of humanity, the persona of humanity, the personas of humanity, the persona of humanity, the personage of humanity, the personages of humanity, the personage of humanity, the personality of humanity, the personalities of humanity, the personality of humanity, the personification of humanity, the personifications of humanity, the personification of humanity, the image of humanity, the images of humanity, the image of humanity, the imagination of humanity, the imaginations of humanity, the imagination of humanity, the belief of humanity, the beliefs of humanity, the belief of humanity, the thought of humanity, the thoughts of humanity, the thought of humanity, the word of humanity, the words of humanity, the word of humanity, the action of humanity, the actions of humanity, the action of humanity, the reaction of humanity, the reactions of humanity, the reaction of humanity, the feeling of humanity, the feelings of humanity, the feeling of humanity, the situation of humanity, the situations of humanity, the situation of humanity, the circumstance of humanity, the circumstances of humanity, the circumstance of humanity, the environment of humanity, the environments of humanity, the environment of humanity, the relationship of humanity, the relationships of humanity, the relationship of humanity, the number of humanity, the numbers of humanity, the number of humanity, the formula of humanity, the formulas of humanity, the formula of humanity, the equation of humanity, the equations of humanity, the equation of humanity, the theory of humanity, the theories of humanity, the theory of humanity, the symbol of humanity, the symbols of humanity, the symbol of humanity, the color of humanity, the colors of humanity, the color of humanity, the thing of humanity, the things of humanity, the thing of humanity, the way of humanity, the ways of humanity, the way of humanity, the place of humanity, the places of humanity, the place of humanity, the time of humanity, the times of humanity, the time of humanity, the event of humanity, the events of humanity, the event of humanity, the result of humanity, the results of humanity, the result of humanity, the crown of humanity, the crowns of humanity, the crown of humanity, the throne of humanity, the thrones of humanity, the throne of humanity, the humanity king. The Humanity Kings. The Humanity Kingdom. The Humanity Kingdoms. The Humanity King's subject. The Humanity King's subjects. The Humanity King's dominion. The Humanity King's dominions. The kingdom of humanity. The kingdoms of humanity. The kingdom of humanity. The Humanity Queen. The Humanity Queens. The Humanity Queendom. The Humanity Queendoms. The Humanity Queen's subject. The Humanity Queen's subjects. The Humanity Queen's dominion. The Humanity Queen's dominions. The Queendom of humanity. The Queendoms of humanity. The Queendom of humanity. The Humanity Prince. The Humanity Princes. The Humanity Princedom. The Humanity Princedoms. The Humanity Prince's subject. The Humanity Prince's subjects. The Humanity Prince's dominion. The Humanity Prince's dominions. The Princedom of humanity. The Princedoms of humanity. The Princedom of humanity. The Humanity Princess. The Humanity Princesses. The Humanity Princessdom. The Humanity Princessdoms. The Humanity Princess's subject. The Humanity Princess's subjects. The Humanity Princess's dominion. The Humanity Princess's dominions. The Princessdom of humanity. The Princessdoms of humanity. The Princessdom of humanity. The Lord of humanity. The Lords of humanity. The Lord of humanity. The Lordess of humanity. The Lordesses of humanity. The Lordess of humanity. The Priest of humanity. The Priests of humanity. The Priest of humanity. The Priestess of humanity. The Priestesses of humanity. The Priestess of humanity. The Ritual of humanity. The Rituals of humanity. The Ritual of humanity. The Shrine of humanity. The Shrines of humanity. The Shrine of humanity. The Temple of humanity. The Temples of humanity. The Temple of humanity. The Leader of humanity. The Leaders of humanity. The Leader of humanity. The Follower of humanity. The Followers of humanity. The Follower of humanity. The Natural Substance of humanity. The Natural Substances of humanity. The Natural Substance of humanity. The Supernatural Substance of humanity. The Supernatural Substances of humanity. The Supernatural Substance of humanity. The Temporal Substance of humanity. The Temporal Substances of humanity. The Temporal Substance of humanity. The Spiritual Substance of humanity. The Spiritual Substances of humanity. The Spiritual Substance of humanity. The Natural Form of humanity. The Natural Forms of humanity. The Natural Form of humanity. The Supernatural Form of humanity. The Supernatural Forms of humanity. The Supernatural Form of humanity. The Temporal Form of humanity. The Temporal Forms of humanity. The Temporal Form of humanity. The Spiritual Form of humanity. The Spiritual Forms of humanity. The Spiritual Form of humanity. The Age of humanity. The Ages of humanity. The Age of humanity. The Era of humanity. The Eras of humanity. The Era of humanity. The Awakener of humanity. The Awakeners of humanity. The Awakener of humanity. The Awakening of humanity. The Awakenings of humanity. The Awakening of humanity. The Realm of humanity. The Realms of humanity. The Realm of humanity. The Dimension of humanity. The Dimensions of humanity. The Dimension of humanity. The Zone of humanity. The Zones of humanity. The Zone of humanity. The Frequency of humanity. The Frequencies of humanity. The Frequency of humanity. The Century of humanity. The Centuries of humanity. The Century of humanity. The Millennium of humanity. The Millenniums of humanity. The Millennium of humanity. The Purpose of humanity. The Purposes of humanity. The Purpose of humanity. The Meaning of humanity. The Meanings of humanity. The Meaning of humanity. The Culture of humanity. The Cultures of humanity. The Culture of humanity. The Demonstrator of humanity. The Demonstrators of humanity. The Demonstrator of humanity. The Demonstration of humanity. The Demonstrations of humanity. The Demonstration of humanity. The Manifester of humanity. The Manifestors of humanity. The Manifester of humanity. The Manifestation of humanity. The Manifestations of humanity. The Manifestation of humanity. The Presence of humanity. The Presences of humanity. The Presence of humanity. The glow of humanity. The glows of humanity. The glow of humanity. The goal of humanity. The goals of humanity. The goal of humanity. The plan of humanity. The plans of humanity. The plan of humanity. The book of humanity. The books of humanity. The book of humanity. The philosopher of humanity. The philosophers of humanity. The philosopher of humanity. The philosophy of humanity. The philosophies of humanity. The philosophy of humanity. The releaser of humanity. The releasers of humanity. The releaser of humanity. The release of humanity. The releases of humanity. The release of humanity. The variable of humanity. The variables of humanity. The variable of humanity. The cause of humanity. The causes of humanity. The cause of humanity. The effect of humanity. The effects of humanity. The effect of humanity. The journey of humanity. The journeys of humanity. The journey of humanity. The emergence of humanity. The emergences of humanity. The emergence of humanity. The source of humanity. The sources of humanity. The source of humanity. The originator of humanity. The originators of humanity. The originator of humanity. The origin of humanity. The origins of humanity. The origin of humanity. The forefather of humanity. The forefathers of humanity. The forefather of humanity. The foremother of humanity. The foremothers of humanity. The foremother of humanity. The ancestor of humanity. The ancestors of humanity. The ancestor of humanity. The descendant of humanity. The descendants of humanity. The descendant of humanity. The lineage of humanity. The lineages of humanity. The lineage of humanity. The heritage of humanity. The heritages of humanity. The heritage of humanity. The heir of humanity. The heirs of humanity. The heir of humanity. The co-heir of humanity. The co-heirs of humanity. The co-heir of humanity. The joint heir of humanity. The joint heirs of humanity. The joint heir of humanity. The dynasty of humanity. The dynasties of humanity. The dynasty of humanity. The force of humanity. The forces of humanity. The force of humanity. The law of humanity. The laws of humanity. The law of humanity. The pact of humanity. The pacts of humanity. The pact of humanity. The game of humanity. The games of humanity. The game of humanity. The mask of humanity. The masks of humanity. The mask of humanity. The armor of humanity. The armors of humanity. The armor of humanity. The sword of humanity. The swords of humanity. The sword of humanity. The shield of humanity. The shields of humanity. The shield of humanity. The force shield of humanity. The force shields of humanity. The force shield of humanity. The armored force shield of humanity. The armored force shields of humanity. The armored force shield of humanity. The champion of humanity. The champions of humanity. The champion of humanity. The guardian of humanity. The guardians of humanity. The guardian of humanity. The defender of humanity. The defenders of humanity. The defender of humanity. The protector of humanity. The protectors of humanity. The protector of humanity. The chant of humanity. The chants of humanity. The chant of humanity. The shape of humanity. The shapes of humanity. The shape of humanity. The cube of humanity. The cubes of humanity. The cube of humanity. The cuboid of humanity. The cuboids of humanity. The cuboid of humanity. The sphere of humanity. The spheres of humanity. The sphere of humanity. The spheroid of humanity. The spheroids of humanity. The spheroid of humanity. The prism of humanity. The prisms of humanity. The prism of humanity. The pyramid of humanity. The pyramids of humanity. The pyramid of humanity. The cylinder of humanity. The cylinders of humanity. The cylinder of humanity. The cone of humanity. The cones of humanity. The cone of humanity. The triangle of humanity. The triangles of humanity. The triangle of humanity. The circle of humanity. The circles of humanity. The circle of humanity. The semicircle of humanity. The semicircles of humanity. The semicircle of humanity. The square of humanity. The squares of humanity. The square of humanity. The rectangle of humanity. the rectangles of humanity, the rectangle of humanity, the parallelogram of humanity, the parallelograms of humanity, the parallelogram of humanity, the rhombus of humanity, the rhombuses of humanity, the rhombus of humanity, the trapezoid of humanity, the trapezoids of humanity, the trapezoid of humanity, the polygon of humanity, the polygons of humanity, the polygon of humanity, the pentagon of humanity, the pentagons of humanity, the pentagon of humanity, the hexagon of humanity, the hexagons of humanity, the hexagon of humanity, the septagon of humanity, the septagons of humanity, the septagon of humanity, the octagon of humanity, the octagons of humanity, the octagon of humanity, the nonagon of humanity, the nonagons of humanity, the nonagon of humanity, the decagon of humanity, the decagons of humanity, the decagon of humanity, the evolution of humanity, the evolutions of humanity, the evolution of humanity, the revolution of humanity, the revolutions of humanity, the revolution of humanity, the elemental art of humanity, the elemental arts of humanity, the elemental art of humanity, the elemental science of humanity, the elemental sciences of humanity, the elemental science of humanity, the elemental principle of humanity, the elemental principles of humanity, the elemental principle of humanity, the elemental technology of humanity, the elemental technologies of humanity, the elemental technology of humanity, the low elemental art of humanity, the low elemental arts of humanity, the low elemental art of humanity, the low elemental science of humanity, the low elemental sciences of humanity, the low elemental science of humanity, the low elemental principle of humanity, the low elemental principles of humanity, the low elemental principle of humanity, the low elemental technology of humanity, the low elemental technologies of humanity, the low elemental technology of humanity, the high elemental art of humanity, the high elemental arts of humanity, the high elemental art of humanity, the high elemental science of humanity, the high elemental sciences of humanity, the high elemental science of humanity, the high elemental principle of humanity, the high elemental principles of humanity, the high elemental principle of humanity, the high elemental technology of humanity, the high elemental technologies of humanity, the high elemental technology of humanity, the agent of humanity, the agents of humanity, the agent of humanity, the agency of humanity, the agencies of humanity, the agency of humanity, the amplifier of humanity, the amplifiers of humanity, the amplifier of humanity, the amplification of humanity, the amplifications of humanity, the amplification of humanity, the enhancer of humanity, the enhancers of humanity, the enhancer of humanity, the enhancement of humanity, the enhancements of humanity, the enhancement of humanity, the magnifier of humanity, the magnifiers of humanity, the magnifier of humanity, the magnification of humanity, the magnifications of humanity, the magnification of humanity, the influencer of humanity, the influencers of humanity, the influencer of humanity, the influence of humanity, the influences of humanity, the influence of humanity, the emanator of humanity, the emanators of humanity, the emanator of humanity, the emanation of humanity, the emanations of humanity, the emanation of humanity, the converger of humanity, the convergers of humanity, the converger of humanity, the convergence of humanity, the convergences of humanity, the convergence of humanity, the aura of humanity, the auras of humanity, the aura of humanity, the impression of humanity, the impressions of humanity, the impression of humanity, the intelligence of humanity, the intelligences of humanity, the intelligence of humanity, the sophistication of humanity, the sophistications of humanity, the sophistication of humanity, the genius of humanity, the geniuses of humanity, the genius of humanity, the polymath of humanity, the polymaths of humanity, the polymath of humanity, the psychic of humanity, the psychics of humanity, the psychic of humanity, the knowledge of humanity, the knowledges of humanity, the knowledge of humanity, the understanding of humanity, the understandings of humanity, the understanding of humanity, the wisdom of humanity, the wisdoms of humanity, the wisdom of humanity, the secret of humanity, the secrets of humanity, the secret of humanity, the mystery of humanity, the mysteries of humanity, the mystery of humanity, the revelation of humanity, the revelations of humanity, the revelation of humanity, the tactic of humanity, the tactics of humanity, the tactic of humanity, the strategy of humanity, the strategies of humanity, the strategy of humanity, the strength of humanity, the strengths of humanity, the strength of humanity, the might of humanity, the mights of humanity, the might of humanity, the power of humanity, the powers of humanity, the power of humanity, the authority of humanity, the authorities of humanity, the authority of humanity, the dominion of humanity, the dominions of humanity, the dominion of humanity, the rhythm of humanity, the rhythms of humanity, the rhythm of humanity, the melody of humanity, the melodies of humanity, the melody of humanity, the music of humanity, the musics of humanity, the music of humanity, the lyric of humanity, the lyrics of humanity, the lyric of humanity, the song of humanity, the songs of humanity, the song of humanity, the dance of humanity, the dances of humanity, the dance of humanity, the spirit of humanity, the spirits of humanity, the spirit of humanity, the soul of humanity, the souls of humanity, the soul of humanity, the body of humanity, the bodies of humanity, the body of humanity, the mark of humanity, the marks of humanity, the mark of humanity, the promise of humanity, the promises of humanity, the promise of humanity, the visionary of humanity, the visionaries of humanity, the visionary of humanity, the vision of humanity, the visions of humanity, the vision of humanity, the picture of humanity, the pictures of humanity, the picture of humanity, the sound of humanity, the sounds of humanity, the sound of humanity, the dung of humanity, the dungs of humanity, the dung of humanity, the language of humanity, the languages of humanity, the language of humanity, the communication of humanity, the communications of humanity, the communication of humanity, the people of humanity, the peoples of humanity, the people of humanity, the society of humanity, the societies of humanity, the society of humanity, the fortress of humanity, the fortresses of humanity, the fortress of humanity, the government of humanity, the governments of humanity, the government of humanity, the city of humanity, the cities of humanity, the city of humanity, the nation of humanity, the nations of humanity, the nation of humanity, the civilization of humanity, the civilizations of humanity, the civilization of humanity, the world of humanity, the worlds of humanity, the world of humanity,